Welcome to a story buried beneath more than a century of silence. A story the South tried to forget. A story written not in monuments, but in whispers. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. These stories travel farther than we ever expect, and we're always curious who hears them and when. In the spring of 1847, the Caldwell plantation stood proudly among the rolling cotton fields of Wilkes County, Georgia. White columns framed the front of the grand house. A wide porch overlooked nearly 800 acres of land worked by dozens of enslaved people whose lives remained invisible to polite society. To outsiders, the Caldwell estate represented everything the Old South admired: wealth, order, tradition. But behind that carefully maintained image, something dangerous had already begun. Thomas Caldwell was a man of influence. His name carried weight in local courts, churches, and social circles. Yet his private life was marked by loss. His wife had died delivering twin daughters, Elizabeth and Catherine, and in his grief he never remarried. Instead, he devoted himself to his land and to his girls. By the age of 22, the twins had become well known throughout the county. Identical in appearance, elegant in manner, admired wherever they went. But whispers followed them too. They were still unmarried. In the rigid world of the antebellum South, that was not simply unusual, it was suspicious. And lately, people had begun to notice something else. The twins were spending less time in the house and more time walking the edges of the plantation, near the stables, near the gardens, near the quarters where the enslaved lived. A longtime housekeeper, Margaret Sullivan, wrote to her sister in Savannah, "The young ladies behave strangely these days. The master pretends not to see." Among the enslaved workers were two men, Samuel and Elijah, purchased several years earlier from a failing plantation in South Carolina. They appeared ordinary to anyone who passed them in the fields, but they carried a secret that could cost them their lives. They could read and write. Literacy was forbidden. Knowledge was dangerous, and so they hid their skill carefully until one autumn evening in 1846. Catherine Caldwell entered the stables unexpectedly and found Samuel holding a discarded newspaper by lantern light. For a moment, time froze. He waited for punishment, for chains, for the whip. But Catherine did something no one could have predicted. She sat down. What followed, according to Catherine's diary discovered more than a century later, began with simple conversation, then questions, then a connection she could neither explain nor escape. Samuel spoke to her not as property, but as an equal mind, about books, about faith, about freedom. For the first time in her life, Catherine was forced to confront a truth she had been raised never to see, that the world she lived in was built on a lie. At nearly the same time, her sister Elizabeth formed a quiet bond of her own with Elijah, the reserved man who tended the gardens near the main house. Their conversations began in passing, then in secret, then in something deeper. Two sisters, two men, two relationships that could never exist in daylight. That winter was one of the coldest Georgia had seen in years. Roads froze, visitors stopped coming, the plantation became isolated, and in that isolation, the forbidden bonds grew stronger. Thomas Caldwell noticed changes in his daughters. Elizabeth became distant, retreating into long silences. Catherine grew restless, pacing the halls at night. He blamed the weather. He blamed boredom. He blamed youth. He never imagined love. Hidden notes passed between the sisters began to appear, tucked inside books, pressed between pages of poetry. One read, "Four hearts beat together in silence. One mistake could cost us everything." They knew the danger. Discovery would mean torture for Samuel and Elijah, disgrace for Elizabeth and Catherine, ruin for the Caldwell name. Yet still they continued. Then, in early March of 1847, Thomas Caldwell made an announcement that sealed their fate. At dinner one evening, he informed his daughters that suitable matches had been arranged, sons of powerful families, proper alliances, secure futures. Elizabeth said nothing. Catherine forced a smile. That night she wrote in her diary, "I smiled while my future collapsed around me." 3 days passed in silence. Then 4 people made a decision that would change history, though no one would know it for more than a century. They would not submit. They would not wait. They would not live a lie. They would disappear. And with that choice, the Caldwell plantation's perfect image began to crack. Not from rebellion in the fields, not from violence in the halls, but from something far more dangerous. In the winter of 1846, the Caldwell plantation was wrapped in silence. Roads froze under thin sheets of ice. Visitors stopped coming. Even the rhythms of daily life slowed beneath the weight of cold evenings and early darkness. Isolation has a way of revealing what routine keeps hidden. And for Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell, isolation revealed the truth they had been raised never to see. Catherine's diary, discovered more than a century later behind a hidden wall panel, offers the clearest window into those months. Her earliest entries speak only of curiosity, of long conversations with Samuel in the stables, of shared laughter, of the strange comfort she felt in his presence. But slowly, her words changed. Curiosity became admiration. Admiration became dependence. Dependence became something she could no longer deny. She wrote of evenings when Samuel read aloud from memory, having memorized passages of scripture and poetry during stolen moments of solitude. She wrote of the shock she felt realizing that the man she had been taught to see as property possessed a depth of thought she had never encountered in the gentleman her father welcomed into their parlor. One entry reads, "I have been blind not only to suffering, but to truth, and now that I see, I cannot unsee." At the same time, Elizabeth's own secret world was forming. Elijah worked in the gardens near the main house, quiet, observant, rarely speaking unless spoken to. Over months of brief exchanges, something began to grow between them. Conversations that began with pleasantries soon drifted toward deeper questions. What does freedom feel like? What does it mean to belong to yourself? Can love exist where law says it cannot? These were not questions meant to be spoken aloud in the South of 1846, but in the stillness of winter evenings, the questions refused to remain silent. Soon the sisters confided in one another. Late at night, in whispered conversations behind closed doors, Elizabeth and Catherine shared what they had been hiding from the world and from themselves. They were in love, not with suitors of good standing, not with men of privilege, but with 2 enslaved men whose lives were legally owned by their father. The realization terrified them. They understood the stakes better than anyone. If discovered, Samuel and Elijah could face brutal punishment, chains, whipping, sale, or worse. Elizabeth and Catherine would be disgraced beyond recovery, their family name permanently stained. Yet even knowing this, they could not walk away. As winter deepened, so did the danger.
The sisters began coordinating their secret meetings with careful precision. One would distract the household while the other slipped away. Sometimes Elizabeth and Catherine switched cloaks to confuse servants. Sometimes they took turns keeping watch. Hidden notes passed between them, written in code, tucked into books, slipped beneath door frames. One message read, "The moon is new tonight. Darkness will be our ally." 4 hearts beat as one, though the world would tear us apart. Thomas Caldwell, unaware of the truth, sensed only that something had changed. Elizabeth withdrew into long silences. Catherine paced the halls, restless, unable to sleep. He attributed it to winter melancholy, the same condition he believed plagued so many young women confined by circumstance. In a letter to his brother in Charleston, he wrote, "The girls are not themselves. I fear the cold has taken hold of their spirits." He never imagined the storm gathering beneath his roof. By February of 1847, the sisters knew they could not maintain the secrecy forever. Rumors had begun to circulate among the servants. The housekeeper watched them closely. The overseer noticed their absences. Even the enslaved community sensed that something dangerous was unfolding. Every glance felt like exposure. Every footstep felt like pursuit. Yet still, they stayed. Until the night everything changed. In early March, Thomas Caldwell summoned his daughters to the dining room. With the confidence of a man who believed his authority absolute, he announced that he had arranged marriages for both of them. Suitable men, wealthy families, a future secured. The words landed like a sentence. Elizabeth lowered her eyes. Catherine forced a smile. Inside, everything shattered. That night, Catherine wrote, "I have never felt such calm and such terror in the same moment. Calm because I know what must be done. Terror because I know what it will cost." For 3 days, the sisters spoke little. They walked the plantation one last time. They memorized the paths through the trees. They whispered with Samuel and Elijah, their plans forming in fragments. They would not wait for marriage. They would not accept separation. They would not allow the world to decide their fate. They would escape.
Not as victims, not as captives, but as partners. The plan was dangerous, perhaps impossible. They would need a distraction. They would need timing. They would need courage beyond anything they had known. And most of all, they would need to leave everything behind. Their home, their inheritance, their family name, their safety. Catherine's final entry before the escape reads, "Tomorrow we step into darkness, but even the darkness of uncertainty is better than the false light of a life built on another's chains." They had crossed the final line. There would be no turning back. And before the next dawn, the Caldwell plantation would awaken to a mystery that would haunt it for generations. In the early hours of March 18, 1847, the Caldwell plantation slept beneath a pale Georgia moon. The fields were quiet, the house dark. Even the dogs lay silent. Then smoke rose. A small blaze ignited near one of the storage sheds by the slave quarters, not large enough to destroy, but large enough to distract. Servants rushed from the house. The overseer was roused from his bed. Buckets of water were passed from hand to hand. The fire was contained quickly, but when the chaos settled, 4 people were gone: Samuel, Elijah, Elizabeth, Catherine. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Then, panic set in. James Whitaker, the plantation overseer, later wrote in his journal, "The men are missing, and the young ladies as well. God help us if what I fear is true." By dawn,
the story had already taken shape. The enslaved men had escaped, and in a crime too shocking to comprehend, they had taken the master's daughters with them. Search parties were organized before the sun reached its peak. Riders were sent to neighboring plantations. Notices were posted at crossroads and taverns. A reward was offered, first for the capture of the men, then for any news of the missing women. Thomas Caldwell did not leave his study. Witnesses later said he walked in circles for hours, speaking to no one. By nightfall, he had stopped eating. By the second day, he had stopped sleeping. To the world, he was a grieving father. To himself, he was a man losing everything. What no one searching the woods and roads could imagine was that there had been no kidnapping, there had been no violence, no struggle. Elizabeth had set the fire herself. A servant woman would later testify, decades later, that Elizabeth confided in her only hours before the escape. "Do not speak of what you know," she whispered. "Silence may save us all." While the plantation focused on smoke and fear, 4 figures moved through the darkness.
Samuel and Elijah led the way, guiding the sisters along a narrow path that wound through oak trees and low marshland. Their route had been planned in fragments over months, whispered directions, half-remembered maps, scraps of knowledge passed quietly among those who dreamed of freedom. They did not run. They walked, slowly, carefully, silently. Each step carried the weight of everything they were leaving behind and everything that waited if they were caught. By dawn, they were miles from the plantation. By nightfall, they were fugitives. For weeks, the search expanded, from Wilkes County into neighboring regions, from Georgia into South Carolina, from quiet concern into public obsession. Newspapers carried rumors, taverns buzzed with speculation. Men boasted of how they would bring the runaways back. The official story hardened quickly. The Caldwell daughters had been abducted. If they were found alive, they would be rescued. If not, their fate would be mourned as a tragedy. The truth that they had chosen to leave was unthinkable. As the manhunt intensified, Thomas Caldwell's health collapsed. Plantation records show that by early April he had taken to his bed. A physician was called from Augusta, then called again. No remedy helped. On May 2, 1847, a letter arrived at the Caldwell house. No one beyond the family ever saw its contents, but those who witnessed the moment never forgot it. Thomas Caldwell read the letter once, then again, then his hands began to shake. According to the doctor, he suffered a violent episode of rage, followed by sudden weakness on his left side. 3 days later, he was dead. The cause was listed simply as apoplexy. What killed him, many believed, was not illness, it was truth. His brother Edward Caldwell arrived from Charleston to manage the estate. Edward was a careful man, methodical, unemotional, and in Thomas's private study he found what the world was never meant to see: a small wooden box. Inside it, crude documents that looked like marriage certificates, not legal in any court, but sacred to those who signed them. Elizabeth Caldwell to Elijah, Catherine Caldwell to Samuel, dated March 17, 1847, the night before the fire. Beneath them lay a letter written in Catherine's careful hand. It was not an apology, it was a declaration. She wrote of love, of conscience, of the impossibility of living in a world where the men they loved were treated as property. She wrote of their plan to flee north, to live not in comfort, but in honesty, and she ended with words that Edward Caldwell could never forgive. "We choose happiness over inheritance, freedom over fear." Edward understood immediately what this meant. His nieces had not been taken. They had rejected everything their family stood for.
The scandal, if revealed, would destroy the Caldwell name. The social consequences would echo for generations. So Edward made a decision. He sealed the box, locked it away, and buried the truth. Publicly, he maintained the story of abduction. Privately, he carried the weight of knowing that his brother had died believing his daughters were victims, when in truth they had been architects of their own escape. While Georgia searched for ghosts, 4 living souls moved quietly through the North. By late April, they reached Philadelphia, exhausted, underfed, and terrified, but alive. They became new people. Samuel took the name Samuel Johnson. Elijah became Elijah Davis. Elizabeth and Catherine erased the past with every word they spoke. No one there knew the truth. That was the point.
Yet even in safety, the fear never left them. They knew the law could still reach north. They knew bounty hunters roamed free states. They knew discovery meant destruction. But for the first time, their lives were their own. Back in Georgia, the Caldwell plantation stood quieter than it ever had before. Rooms once filled with laughter echoed with absence. Fields once alive with work now carried only rumor and regret. And a story began to grow. A story of tragedy, of loss, of daughters stolen by darkness. But the truth was far more dangerous than any myth. They were not stolen. They walked away. Freedom does not arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments, in small moments that feel unreal at first, until they become a life. By the spring of 1847, 4 fugitives had become 4 strangers in a new world. In the narrow streets of Philadelphia, Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell were no longer plantation daughters. Samuel and Elijah were no longer property. Here they were simply people. But freedom came with fear. Every knock at the door felt like danger. Every uniform looked like pursuit. Every unfamiliar face carried a question they dared not answer. They settled in a modest boarding house near the river, run by a widow named Mrs. Hannah Porter, a quiet woman with kind eyes and an unspoken understanding of secrets. She asked no questions about their past. She simply offered 4 beds and silence. Samuel found work at a small printing shop. His ability to read and write, once hidden, now became his greatest strength. Elijah labored on the docks by day and studied arithmetic by candlelight at night, determined to never again live at the mercy of another man's ledger. Elizabeth and Catherine took positions sewing garments in a textile workshop. Long hours, sore fingers, modest pay. But for the first time in their lives, every coin they earned belonged to them. Still, the past followed them like a shadow. They used their new names carefully. They avoided speaking of Georgia. They memorized their new stories, where they were born, how they met, why they came north. Truth had become a liability. And yet their love remained their anchor. In a small Quaker meeting house on the edge of the city, Elizabeth and Elijah stood before a handful of witnesses and spoke vows that carried no legal weight, but all the meaning in the world. Weeks later, Catherine and Samuel did the same. There were no fine dresses, no grand ceremony, no family in attendance, only quiet promises spoken under simple wooden beams. They were married not by law, but by choice, and in that choice they built something stronger than any inheritance. Yet even in the North, safety was fragile. The Fugitive Slave Act loomed over every free black person like a storm cloud. Bounty hunters prowled the streets. Kidnappings were whispered about in taverns and churches alike. Samuel and Elijah never walked alone at night. Elizabeth and Catherine learned to keep their eyes down in public, not out of submission, but out of survival. Their love was real, but it was still dangerous. In 1849, danger came closer than they ever expected. A man from Georgia arrived in Philadelphia, a former Caldwell associate, drawn north by rumors that the missing daughters might still be alive.
His name was Henry Whitmore, and he had questions. Elizabeth recognized him instantly from across a market square. The shock nearly stole her breath. That night, the four of them gathered in silence, fear hanging in the air like smoke. If Whitmore recognized them, if he spoke to the authorities, if word returned south, everything would end. Within days, they made the hardest decision of their new lives. They would leave Philadelphia. Not because they were unhappy, but because freedom meant staying one step ahead of the past. By early summer, they boarded a train heading west toward Ohio, where abolitionist communities offered greater protection. They settled near Oberlin, a town known quietly across the country as a place where runaways were hidden and defended. Here, they found something they had never known before: community. Neighbors who did not ask questions, friends who shared food when times were hard, strangers who stood watch at night just in case danger returned. Samuel became a teacher in a small schoolhouse that welcomed students of every background. Elijah apprenticed as a carpenter, slowly mastering a craft that would one day support his family. Elizabeth and Catherine began writing again. Letters, essays, reflections, capturing a story they could never share publicly but could not allow to vanish. Years passed. Fear slowly gave way to routine. Routine became peace. Peace became something almost unbelievable: normal life. Children were born. Friendships deepened. The past loosened its grip. Yet none of them ever forgot the cost of what they had chosen. They lived knowing that their happiness had been purchased with exile, that their families in the South believed them dead or worse. Sometimes, late at night, Catherine would sit by the window and whisper her sister's name, not Elizabeth, but the girl she had once been, a daughter of privilege, a prisoner of expectation, a stranger to herself. She did not miss that life, but she mourned the years lost to silence. In 1861, as the nation fractured and war began to tear the country apart, their fears returned. If the South won, if slavery survived, their past would hunt them again. But history moved in a different direction. With each passing year of war, hope grew, and when news of emancipation reached their town, the four of them stood together in quiet disbelief. What they had risked everything for, the nation was finally beginning to confront. They had not run in vain. They had not suffered alone. They had not loved in darkness for nothing. They had lived years ahead of their time. By the late 1860s, their children knew only fragments of the truth: that their parents had come from the South, that they had chosen each other against impossible odds, that love had carried them across a line few dared to cross. The full story remained hidden, not out of shame, but out of protection. Some truths are too dangerous to give the world. Others are too precious to risk losing. In a small farmhouse outside Oberlin, Elizabeth once wrote in a private journal, "We were taught courage looks like defiance. I have learned it often looks like leaving quietly, holding love close, and never looking back." They were no longer fugitives. They were no longer rebels. They were something far rarer, a family born of choice in a world built on force. Some stories are buried because they are forgotten. Others are buried because they are too dangerous to remember. For more than 100 years, the disappearance of the Caldwell sisters remained one of Georgia's most haunting mysteries, a tragedy whispered in family circles, repeated in local histories, and eventually reduced to a footnote.
But in 1998, a renovation project in the old Caldwell estate uncovered something no one expected, and everything changed. Behind a false panel in what had once been Thomas Caldwell's private study, workers discovered a narrow cavity. Inside it lay a small wooden box sealed with a rusted clasp. Time had yellowed its contents, but history had not erased them. Inside
were documents that rewrote the past. 2 handwritten declarations of marriage, a bundle of letters tied with fading ribbon, and a single journal, its pages fragile, its ink still legible. The name on the first page stopped every historian in their tracks: Catherine Caldwell. For generations, it had been assumed she died young, lost during the supposed abduction. Now, here was her voice, speaking across time. The journal chronicled everything, not in rage, not in bitterness, but in clarity. Catherine wrote of love discovered where it was forbidden, of the moment she realized that comfort built on another's captivity was not comfort at all, it was theft. She wrote of the fear that stalked every step of their escape, of the shame she felt for leaving behind those who could not run. And she wrote of hope, quiet, stubborn hope, that one day the truth would matter more than the scandal it once threatened to cause. One passage reads, "If this is ever found, let it be known that we were not stolen, we chose, and in choosing, we became who we were meant to be." News of the discovery spread quickly, first through academic circles, then through local newspapers, then across the country. A story once whispered became a headline. For descendants of the Caldwell family, the revelation was devastating. Generations had grown up believing in a narrative of tragedy and innocence. Now they were forced to confront a different truth, one that exposed not just a family secret, but the moral contradictions at the heart of an era. For the descendants of Samuel and Elijah, the discovery was something else entirely. It was vindication. For years, family legends had spoken of brave ancestors who fled bondage and built new lives in the North. But the details were always blurred, names changed, dates lost, faces remembered only in fading photographs. Now the fragments aligned. The men they honored as founders of their family lines were no longer just survivors. They were pioneers of love in a world that tried to make love illegal. A team of historians began tracing the lives of the 4 runaways beyond Oberlin. Census records, church registries, school ledgers, gravestones in quiet cemeteries. The pieces formed a portrait of ordinary lives lived extraordinarily. Samuel Johnson, once Samuel of the Caldwell plantation, became a respected educator who taught generations of children to read, believing literacy was the first step to freedom. Elijah Davis, once Elijah the gardener, built a carpentry business that employed free black men when opportunity was still rare. Elizabeth and Catherine became known in their community not as runaways, but as mentors, caretakers, and quiet advocates for justice, women who never spoke publicly of their past, yet lived every day as proof that conscience can outgrow circumstance. They did not write books, they did not seek recognition, they did not stand on stages. Their rebellion was quieter. They built families. They raised children. They lived openly in a way that once would have cost them everything. And in doing so, they changed the future in ways history almost forgot. In 2003, a small memorial was placed near the ruins of the old Caldwell plantation. It does not bear a long explanation, only 4 names and 1 sentence. They chose freedom together. Visitors often stand in silence before it, trying to imagine the courage it must have taken to walk away from everything known towards everything unknown. Because courage, as their story reveals, is not always loud. Sometimes it does not shout. Sometimes it does not fight. Sometimes it simply leaves. The Caldwell story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that love has always existed beyond the boundaries society tries to impose, that morality does not always align with legality, and that progress is often carried forward not by grand revolutions, but by small, impossible choices made in the dark. 4 people stepped into that darkness in 1847. They did not know if they would survive. They did not know if history would ever remember them. They only knew they could no longer live a lie. Today, their descendants gather every few years in Oberlin, not for spectacle, but for remembrance. They walk the same quiet streets, visit the same small cemeteries, stand before simple headstones that mark lives once hidden. And in those moments, the past feels close enough to touch, not as tragedy, not as scandal, but as testament. A testament that love can cross lines drawn by fear. A testament that freedom is sometimes claimed long before it is granted. A testament that history is not only written by those in power, but by those brave enough to walk away from it. They were once called runaways. They were once called lost. They were once called victims of circumstance. But now we know them by a better name.